Hey everyone, welcome to Photomotion Depth. More specifically, welcome to your first animation in Photomotion Depth. I'm so excited to see you here, and although Photomotion does require a little bit of learning at the beginning, I'm pretty sure you will love the versatility of Photomotion Depth. I'll leave you with Jack and David, who will be your teachers. I found the best way is to follow along and animate together, so feel free to pause this video at any point or rewind back if you missed something. Alright, that's all from me. Take it away, Jack.
Hey, what's going on there, guys? In this video, we're going to be showing you our projection system Depth. First things first, we've downloaded and extracted the zip onto our desktop, so let's jump into the folder here. Right, so we're not going to worry about anything else, we just want access to the projections, so we'll double click on that folder. We'll then be greeted by all of our projection systems: Parallax, Horizon, Mirage, Portrait, Glacier, and of course, last but not least, Depth. So with that said, we'll just double click on this depth folder here, which will bring us into this folder with our project file. So what we want to do here is just double click on it and then wait for After Effects to load. Now, Photomotion is a project-based toolkit, so no need to fiddle with scripts or extensions. We're ready to run straight from this screen here. And of course, one last thing, Photomotion is actually a viewport-based application too, so most of the work is done within the viewport and of course within effect controls. In any case, let's move on from within our project. We'll, of course, just click this Start Depth, which will then bring us into the main dashboard. There'll be many blanked off areas at first, but not to worry, they're just locked off in order to stop us from jumping the gun. We'll then click on this Add Photo button on the main dashboard to begin the photo animation process. This composition will look pretty bland at first, but that's because we need to import our picture. So let's just go to File, then Import, and then finally File. Of course, it's as simple as finding the photo that you want to animate. Finally, we'll then import this picture and then drag it from the project panel into this composition. Now, before we start fidgeting with scaling or otherwise, we'll need to parent this layer to the layer above whilst holding Shift, and then position and scaling this image from said parent layer above. This is just in case we have any additional elements that we've made and we want to import them into the project, but also have them proportional to the background image. Once we're in the main dashboard, we can change our aspect ratio into something that resonates better with social media, say for example portrait, by going over to the resolution button on the main dashboard and then hopping over to effect controls, where this drop down just next to aspect ratio sits. We'll then change this to portrait, and what that will do is crop our animation and export it into that aspect ratio. This aspect ratio will follow us into the export screen. Right, so on to sorting out our depth. Double click on this Add Depth button here, which will bring us into this composition. We have two options here. We can either import our depth map from a file like Photoshop, or you may have taken a really good portrait shot on the phone, or we can create it. Within this example, we'll be creating our own, so we'll be double clicking on the Smart Depth button just over here. Right, so this is our Smart Depth. What this will essentially do is create a representation of what parts of our image are where in terms of our depth. So using these four layers here, we'll be masking out parts of our image in correlation to how far we expect it to be. So close would be the parts of the image that are closest to the camera, and thus we'll see the most amount of movement. Middle will be of course in the middle and therefore have less movement than the close layer, and the same can be said for further and distant. Now, to begin the process, we'll be selecting the close layer just over here and then clicking on the pen tool just up here, masking out the dog's nose, the paws, and a little bit of the sleeve. When masking, just keep in mind that it should be general and we don't need to get bogged down with details like masking out the whiskers or actually masking out the nose itself separately, on the pretext of course that they roughly occupy the same depth. Okay, so we're going to do exactly the same with the middle, clicking on the middle layer here, and then we'll begin masking off exactly what we expect to be in the middle of our depth here. So like the hands here, most of the body of the puppy, minus the ears, and lastly the remainder of the other hands. Hopefully you can get a better gist of what we're trying to do here. So we'll be masking out the remainder of this doggo using the further layer just down here. So again, click on it and then begin masking. We'll then be grabbing the remainder of the features here, like the ears and the rest of the puppy's body, and then when we're finished we should have a mask a little bit like this. You can see each independent layers with their depth. Now, before going back to the edit depth composition we were in a second ago, just make sure to swap out the pen tool for the selection tool. After all, we really don't want to be masking off our buttons. So this is our depth map as it stands. A displacement map is basically information telling After Effects how far parts of the image are away from the camera, and thus how much movement we should see within those sections. So for example, the nose is somewhere where we would expect to see the most amount of movement, but the further back to the image you go, low, the more grey it becomes until we reach black, where we would see no movement at all. Okay, so with that being said, the outlines of our depth layers are too rigid, and we will more than certainly see a few distortions. So we're just going to click on the settings button over here and then drag up this blur displacement, which will blur out our displacement map, adding some feather to our edges. We will then bring up this auto displacement layers slider, which will spread the depth throughout our image. If we raise this up too much, however, we can see that we lose a lot of rigid definition in terms of the grayscale, and now it looks all the same really, which isn't exactly what we want. If we bring it even further, we can see that now parts of our image are completely dark, where we're not going to see any movement at all. Far less ideal. So let's bring it back to here, where we're seeing some of those lighter areas, but they blend rather quite nicely with the rest of our displacement map. We'll also bring up this background lightness, and what that will do is just reduce the amount of space between the subject and the background within the animation. In other words, your animation will see less movement between the last layer and the background, which can help minimize the amount of distortions that you're seeing. If we bring up this auto displacement background up, this will spread our depth from our main subject to the background, meaning we'll see more movement around the outline of the animation because there's a greater contrast. So with our displacement map all set, let's jump back to the main dashboard and start animating our image. We'll start by bringing our time head to the 30 frames point. Now the controller within depth works similar to the one in portrait, as it controls the direction that our displacement map is facing. So if we move this up, we can see that there's a change in the posture of the pug. Let's bring the playhead back to the start of the animation and change the direction so it's facing down. And if we preview this now, we have this nice simple animation of this puppy with this nodding movement. And you'll notice that it keeps on going past the end keyframe, and that's because we have auto loop enabled, which means that this animation will loop out indefinitely within our timeline. With that done, we should probably now alter this a tiny bit to make sure it's a tad more dynamic. So we'll bring this playhead to the 30 frames point. We'll then click on the magnify button on the top of the controller in order to bring up all of the zoom attributes within effect controls. So we can add some zoom into the end of our animation by dragging this slider along. If we also click on the button to the left of the controller, we can see that we can add some rotation from the slider in effect controls, which will also add that extra bit of movement. Now, if we preview this, we can see that it's actually pretty dynamic now, and it's looking pretty good. However, we can still make this better. There isn't enough movement on the feet of the puppy or the hands of the person. So let's get to fixing that now by going back to the edit depth. We'll be clicking on this layer, paint depth on this layer, ensuring that our playhead is at the very beginning. And then we'll be using the brush tool just up here. And after we've got that selected, we'll be double clicking on the viewport in order to start painting. We'll then bring up the paint overlay image opacity in order to have a working guide on where we're painting. However, before we start painting, we're just going to ensure that our swatch is set to white, and of course that our flow is around 5%. All we'll be doing here is just applying a light touch to the hands here and the paws and of course the nose. We're just applying the final details here, so no need to over exaggerate it. So with all of that done, we'll be bringing down this image layer opacity guide and then swap out the brush tool for the selection tool. So if we preview this animation now, we now have a lot more movement on the paws and the hands here, which is actually pretty neat. If we're happy with our animation, let's look at adding some particles into our project. All we need to do is just click on the settings button down here and then go over to effect controls in order to tick this activate particles checkbox. That will enable particles which are fully immersed within our 3D scene. If we change this particle type, we can see a lot more suitable particles for this animation, and we have tons to pick from. So in previewing the animation, hopefully you can see that these particles have their own depth inbuilt into the scene, making them fully immersed within the 3D environment. So they're popping out too much here though, so what we want to do in effect controls is just change the curves to alpha and then crunch these highlights here, making them a tad less visible. Cool, so before we click on render, let's just think about how long our animation is. If we want to extend the length of our animation, we can do so by just dragging these last keyframes along to the point where we want it to end. In our case, it's 50 frames along. Now, if we're happy, we can double click on this export button and we'll be greeted by our export composition. At the bottom of the viewport, we can see a series of numbers here. This is the Photomotion Perfect Cut system. What this is telling us in frames is where we need to be in terms of frame count in order to achieve a specific number of loops. So we have 50 frames just for that one base animation, 100 frames if we want to render out that boomerang back out, and then 200 for a loop of both, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So we'll just go over to the frame count, type in 200 for that 2 times loop. But before we even think about exporting though, we'll need to make sure that we mark mark out our working area by hitting N on the keyboard. Otherwise, After Effects will still render out the whole entire composition, which is hardly ideal. Cool, let's start rendering this out by going to Composition and then click on Add to Render Queue just up here. What this will do is just open the After Effects render engine down here. We'll then click on this lossless here in order to bring up the output module settings. What we want to do is just change this AVI to QuickTime, which in turn will change the overall output to .mov instead of this hefty AVI. Click OK and we'll just check that our output destination is to our liking. All we need to do now is just hit render. Okay, so if we wanted an MP4 on the other hand for uploading to social media, say for example, we'll have to bring this in some way, shape or form into Adobe Media Encoder. We can do this directly from the After Effects project, but that will create a duplicate of the original project, which is not great for space issues. Or we can do what we're doing at the moment, which is exporting the out as a .mov, then bring it into Media Encoder post-render. It's user choice really. We're just going to make sure that the format here is set to H.264 and we're good to re-render. And there we go, that's a basic example on how depth works. In case you want something a little bit more advanced, we have a plethora of classes available. As usual, thanks for watching. We hope you find this video useful and of course enjoy your photo animation journey.